trust and safety. And under that area, we're working on setting up the first ever national computer emergency response team in Georgia, which is basically a group of information security experts responsible for protection against detection of and response to the cybersecurity incidents. So definitely you can see that while digital harm is a new topic for Georgia, we are definitely taking some concrete steps to combat its effects and protect our children. Back to you, Sean.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you very much. It's really encouraging to hear how the government is trying to stay ahead of this in Georgia. So I'd like to come back to a point that Karen raised, and I'm going to ask Jacqueline a question. Karen raised this issue of doing impact assessment, and Safaricom is a mature company, and they have the capacity to do these impact assessments before they implement new technology. But how do you see these issues affecting, a startup, a small company, a medium-sized company that doesn't have these kinds of resources that Safaricom has or Snap has? What's their responsibility as they develop and go to market with new social media apps, etc.? Jacqueline, over to you.
Well, I would say, Sean, that some of the smaller companies or medium-sized companies, it's important for them to be engaged with others in industry, to be engaged with NGOs. There are a lot of benefits that they'll derive from joining organizations like the Technology Coalition and the mentorship and the leveraging of technology and other resources that you called out earlier. So they might not have the abundance of resources available that many of us, the larger companies have, and some of the medium-sized companies have. But it is a legal obligation at the end of the day that when they are made aware of this kind of content on their platforms, particularly if they're a US company, obviously, that they have an obligation to address it and to report it. So it's in their best interest, it's in their business interest to make sure that they are taking down this content, and they have an obligation to their users to protect them from this kind of vile material. But I would encourage them to get involved with others in industry, learn from others, leverage the free technology that's available to be shared amongst industry, and share best practices and resourcing.
Thanks, Jacqueline. That's helpful. Karen, if I can come back to you, you were talking about creating, really taking all the risks into account and doing a strong analysis before moving forward. So, this issue of trying to outsmart the bad actors, but the bad actors, predators, are constantly changing their tactics to get access to children, to exploit children, and avoid consequences. How does Safaricom try to stay ahead of these types of bad actors and their schemes?
Thank you, Sean, for the question. So I'll just share with you some of the products we've done, then I'll explain to you what we've done to stay ahead. So we have safety through product design. So when you look at our products, we have something called SecureNet. This is a service within the fiber to home that allows parents and guardians to block sites that have inappropriate content for children, and they can place age and time limit and usage on our fiber network. So that's one of the products we've done. Then we launched a product called Base. So this is a subscription-based mobile fast video demand service that offers a wide selection of local and regional short entertainment videos. And on this platform, we realized that if we do not give child-friendly content, then the children might access content that is not for them. So we have put in there 106 hours of child-based edutainment content. So this is totally controlled by Safaricom, just trying to give children access to content that is that can entertain them, but it is also educational. Then on the bigger scale, if you look at refugees in Kenya, we have quite 2 refugee camps to be accurate. So we developed something called Instant Network Schools. This was set up in 2013 by Vodafone Foundation and UNHCR, the refugee agency, to give our refugee host communities and their teachers access to digital learning content and the internet, therefore improving quality of education in the marginalized communities in Africa. So with this, we have done 36 of these in 8 refugee camps in Kenya, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Sudan. So where we, Safaricom, operate, we've given connectivity to these schools. But over and above giving connectivity to these schools, we do educate the children on safe content online, on, let me call it, internet hygiene. So we do take the children in the refugee camp on what is expected of them when we give them this. And what also excites me most is things like partnership with UNICEF. We have something called Internet of Good Things. Yes, indeed, there's harmful content, but we have Internet of Good Things. So this we did with UNICEF, where we give mobile packaged content designed to make life-changing and life-improving information free and available, even on a low-end device. It aims to bridge the digital divide and build knowledge in our societies. So we do cater for these costs. So how do we stay ahead? So when we stay ahead at Safaricom, we know we are an internet service provider, and we are tasked with empowering children and their parents and guardians and teachers with the technological ability to keep away predators. So as I shared briefly previously, we have innovated and we continue to innovate to ensure our products and services provide robust tools and parental controls. We also conduct awareness sessions to equip the children and the stakeholders with relevant information that will enable them access the internet safely. If I just touch a little bit on some of the collaborations, there's an initiative we call We Care Initiative. So in collaboration with our community, a child online interactive portal. So the portal helps create a safer online environment for children and gives tips for guardians. So this portal is accessible. We have it. Any parent, any guardian, children can log in because we've already sanitized everything in it, and we've ensured that nobody can hack the portal and post anything. Then with the Internet Watch Foundation, we are proactively every other day blocking any sites. If it is flagged globally, we also do it here. We flag it. We ensure that the children have no access to inappropriate or harmful content. With UNICEF, I loved the Stop It, Spot It campaign, because such campaigns do build momentum to ensure that our children do understand the use of internet for good as opposed to harmful practices. So as a business, we keep on innovating and trying to see how else can we secure the children. And the thing I love most about the environment in which we operate in, we are not shy to borrow with pride. So globally, if we see somebody has done something that we can borrow with pride and implement it locally, we do that as part of our innovative approach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Karen, I love that. There's this extraordinary opportunity within industry to learn from one another. One of the things that we do within our coalition is facilitate peer-to-peer mentoring. Jacqueline mentioned this. We have experienced companies like Snap or Safaricom come alongside new and young companies that may have an extraordinary amount of users, but they're still very young in their development and in their trust and safety practices. And we get these professionals, experienced professionals from these more mature companies to mentor the trust and safety staff in these younger companies. And that's been critical in terms of building out the capacity of small companies to immediately address these issues and keep children safe as their platforms gain traction. Nana, I want to talk to you. You know, you're our resident expert today on youth and development and digital safety. So, you know, from that perspective, what do you really think industry can do to minimize the negative impacts? I mean, you talked a little bit about the positive impacts and the desire for access to the internet, which I think is very important to remember. But what can industry, from your perspective, do to minimize the negative impacts of technology as the access increases?
Thank you, Sean. That's a broad question, and I'm sure that everyone here might have a different answer and approach to that question. However, I'll try to answer it based on my own experience and perspective. I think the first thing that has to be done is that efforts to protect children need to focus particularly on vulnerable and disadvantaged children who may be less likely to understand online risks and more likely to suffer from harm. For example, speaking from the Georgia perspective again, there are minority groups who are living in remote regions, and none of the resources are available in their own language. Media is not accessible to them. So what EY has been doing was that we provided some of the translated materials to them on different topics. So I guess tying back this to what other speakers have been speaking today, definitely, I would say that the private sector has unique role and responsibilities to shape the impact of digital and technology on children. The power and influence of the private sector should be leveraged, as Jacqueline has mentioned, to advance industry-wide ethical standards, such as, for example, data and privacy, as well as other practices that benefit and protect children online. Another thing that can be done is that technology and internet companies should take more concrete and specific steps to prevent their networks and services from being used by offenders to collect and distribute child sexual abuse images or commit other violations against children. And to conclude on a broader level, what governments can do and must do is to put children at the center of digital policy. That would be.
Thank you, Nana.
Thank you.
That's great. Jacqueline, I want to come back to you. We have this extraordinary opportunity where we have industry talking to development professionals today, and from your perspective, as you know, as USAID pushes for development in, as Nana said, vulnerable, marginalized communities, what do you think are the key risks that they should be aware of, and how do you see the development community working with industry to reduce those risks?
I think what Nana said about the vulnerable and the disadvantaged children and reaching out to them in their own languages and with their own and meeting them where they are, that is so critical. And I see that as a priority and an opportunity moving forward, because they are the youth that are being targeted online, and they are the youth that are falling victim to some of these crimes and harms that are occurring in a broad scale. So we've got to embrace those opportunities to really reach out to those youth, to give them the tools, to educate them, to talk to them about being resilient, thinking critically, acting critically, not taking everything at face value. There's so much common sense that really comes into online safety. And I think we often forget that when we think about the technology and all of the sophisticated elements surrounding it. I think we can really break it down to some common sense practices that are rooted in good civil behaviors. And if we can communicate them, drive this to its simplicity, I think that would really help.
Thanks, Jacqueline. And Karen, I want to sort of ask you the same question. I think, we have this opportunity where you're speaking to a group of Americans, right, about development, and coming from your perspective, how can we, this group of American development professionals, as we engage, how can we work with industry companies like Safaricom to ensure that we don't create potential for harm, as we help build these pathways for technology to engage with communities that previously didn't have it?
Yeah. So I think from where I sit, and just reflecting back and seeing the digital divide that we saw when Corona hit, when COVID-19 hit, we realized that there's a huge digital divide between the haves and the have-nots, and the children who could afford to continue with their education because they had online content. So I know USAID wants to play in this space, which is a fantastic space to play in. But as you come to create this divide, just be aware at the back of your mind that there's the internet of good, but yet there's all these exposures. And we've learned this lesson in taking the internet and connectivity to marginalized areas. We realized that we had to invest not only in the technology, but in the human part of the technology. This is where many people forget that we have the human part of the technology. This is where you do a lot of advocacy, you do a lot of lobbying, you do a lot of policies, and a lot of training. So for me, I see a good space when you want to bridge the digital divide by looking at what are the policies that we have. Where can we strengthen the policies? Who are the digital partners? Are they working in the child online space? Yeah? Or are you picking the cheapest, easiest partner to work with? Yeah? So would you want to invest in a partner who also wants to invest in the community? So when you're looking at the partners to do this, be mindful of who are the people already working. Or if not, include it in your package that we need to see what are the secure nets you've put around the internet. Yeah. Then looking at government, as you work with governments, what else can the governments do? Are the governments aware, or are children the weak and the meek that nobody talks about? So are the children at the center of discussion? Are the youth at the center of the discussion? Are we putting out there products that are youth and child friendly? So I would say it's a matter of having the risks at the back of your mind and looking at policy, government, and partnerships that will get you to where you want to go, but also bearing in mind the safety of the people you want to impact their lives.
And Karen, if I can just quickly follow up, and then Nana, I'm going to ask you the same question. What are the investments with respect to governments that USAID can make that will help deal with the consequences of these issues or reduce the potential for harm? What do you see, Karen?
I see. So from where I see it, first I see policy. What are the policy changes? What is the policy that is there? Do we have a child online safety policy anchored in government? Or is it the one the telecommunications companies did? So one is policy. Then two, invest in awareness. Awareness from the guardians, parents, caregivers, the community. So I see if we tackle the policy side and the implementation side, then we have a good balance of ensuring that we bridge the digital divide, but in the correct way. But also setting out the right projects for the right communities. And I think it was Jacqueline Onana who said, they cannot all be one fit all kind of project. It has to be customized to the needs of the country, to the needs of the community that is being targeted.
Okay, great, Karen. Thank you. And Nana, when you think about what types of investments can be made in government from a development perspective, what would you like to see?
Thank you, Sean. I can only echo what Karen has said because I think that's more of a universal type of an approach. I would only highlight the awareness part more for Georgia because where the government is currently working so much on policies. However, once the policies are enacted, the population, children, all other relevant stakeholders have to be informed about that. So I think much focus and effort currently has to be focused on the awareness campaigns and other relevant materials that can help kind of introduce the notion of digital harm to the population.
Thank you, Nana. And I feel like we've come full circle. Jacqueline started off with talking about we need a whole of society approach, and we can see how there is a unique role for industry to play in terms of prevention, in terms of identification, detection, and reporting. But there also needs to be a handoff, right? And then other people have other roles to play. The government has a significant role to play. Civil society has a significant role to play. We all have to play our specific roles. And I'm really grateful to our panelists today for being with us and for giving their time and sharing their expertise. And I'm grateful for the diversity of perspectives we were able to bring to this conversation. And I'm grateful that Karen and particularly Nana had an opportunity to speak to the U.S. government and give them some advice. So we want to thank everybody for your time today. And we want to thank you for listening to our panelists. And I particularly want to thank our panelists. Fantastic job, everybody. Please have a great afternoon. Thank you, or evening, wherever you are. Take care.
Hi, my name is Craig Jolly, and I'm with the Technology Division in USAID's Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. I really want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak briefly today on my experiences trying to research and understand digital ecosystems in development. As part of the implementation of USAID's digital strategy, I'm leading the Digital Ecosystem Country Assessment Initiative. We call it DECA for short. And the goal of the DECA is really to get a holistic understanding of what's happening in a country's digital ecosystem. Okay, so what you are seeing to the left of my face here is a representation of our understanding of a digital ecosystem. So this guides the scope and the structure of our DECA assessments, and it reflects the way that we think about digital ecosystems more broadly at USAID. So you'll see these three circles here, which represent our three pillars. The first one is digital infrastructure and adoption. So there we're really concerned with the state of connectivity infrastructure, how people are able to get online, what technologies they use to do it, how affordable it might be, and particularly where there are gaps in access or inequities in access, whether those are with regards to gender or geography or other factors that could limit the extent to which people are able to get online and take advantage of what the digital ecosystem has to offer. The second big area that we look at is what we call digital society rights and governance. And here we're thinking about two main things. One of these is internet freedom, or the extent to which people's rights are being protected online, or maybe to which those rights are being violated online. So we're looking at questions around censorship, around surveillance, around the kinds of institutions and structures that are there to ensure that human rights are respected online. The other big area that we look at under this pillar is digital government, which is this bubble over here. And there we're working to understand how governments are using digital technology, often in a very positive way, to deliver services more efficiently, to manage their own processes better, and to engage with the public. The third of our pillars is focused on the digital economy. And there we're thinking about the ways in which digital technologies are transforming countries' economies. This could be through the digital delivery of financial services. It could be through e-commerce or digital trade. There are a lot of ways in which technology is changing the ways that economies work and the ways in which people earn a living. Around the middle here, you see this donut that has our 4 cross-cutting topics in it. So these are cybersecurity, inclusion, emerging technologies. So there we're thinking about AI and blockchain and all that fun cutting-edge technology. And then the last one is geopolitical positioning, where we're thinking about how a country's relationships with its neighbors and with other global powers both shape and are shaped by its digital ecosystem. So I'll be totally honest with you, we're still exploring the best place to put the protection of children and youth in this framework. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to about today's discussion is hearing from all of you who are experts in this area and learning more about how you're framing this issue and how you would think of child and youth protection as fitting into this broader digital ecosystem notion. I think one place where the DECA initiative can really contribute is by providing a baseline level understanding of the rest of the ecosystem. So as we continue to do these assessments in countries around the world, we'll be able to identify places where child protections are more robust or maybe where they're in more need of strengthening. And we can see which other features of digital ecosystems are going to correlate with those robust child protections. It could be part of national digitalization strategies. It could have to do with strong data protection legislation. It might have to do with cybersecurity capacity in the private sector, in the government, or digital literacy among the population generally. All of those things are plausible, and with time we'll come to know which of those are really true and which of those features of the broader ecosystem help to enable the protection of children and youth, and which features we might find in ecosystems will undermine the effective protection of children and youth. So again, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with more of you during and after today's conference and learning more about how we can work together. Thank you so much.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Cardefeld-Winter. I work at UNICEF at the Office of Research, where I lead the research on children and digital technologies. Me and my team fulfill quite a specific function within UNICEF related to data and evidence generation. Basically, we design, we implement data collection programs in all parts of the world. Most of these are large-scale survey projects where we speak to children and their families about the risks and opportunities they face online. Our Global Kids Online survey methodology is one such example, which we developed together with the London School of Economics, and that has been implemented by UNICEF, by other partners in more than 40 countries all around the world. Our approach to data collection and evidence generation can be summarized by two principles. The first is that our data collection instruments are always child-centered. And by that I mean that we work very hard to ensure that the questions we ask of children in our research allow them to respond in ways that accurately represent their experiences. And what this means in practice is that we don't allow our own adult biases to determine which response options, for example, we provide to a survey question about online risk. And this is because adults often assume, rather than assess, how likely a certain online risk is to actually translate into feelings of harm for the child. And it turns out that many things that adults assume would upset children actually don't. To be more concrete, initial research on stranger danger, or children going to meet online contacts offline, showed that such a small proportion of children had a negative experience that when we designed our Global Kids Online methodology, we also included a positive response to this question, which didn't exist before. And research that we've done since then shows that across 30 or so countries, very consistently, 85% or more of children say that they felt happy about meeting an online contact offline. And I don't say that to diminish the risk of serious harm that meeting online contacts offline can have for children and do have for children, only to show that when we do research with children, we must make space for them to express their experiences in full. The second core pillar of our research is that it needs to be nationally focused but internationally comparable. And the reason for the national focus is that very often change happens on the ground in the countries where we work, through local governments, through civil society actors, families, parents, etc. It is quite rare, at least in this field, at least so far, that change is spurred by international agreement or cross-border solutions. But even in such cases, we still need to know how a particular problem plays out nationally in order to be able to address it in a way that makes sense. At the same time, though, we design all of our research to be comparable across countries so that we contribute to the global evidence base. Because comparable data is very, very powerful when you want to assess global patterns and try to determine which kinds of policies or programs, for example, might increase or reduce risk or better advance some opportunities for children. Now, the purpose of all of the research that we do is to ensure that UNICEF and our partners in government and civil society and really any organization working to advance the rights of children have access to the highest quality evidence possible to inform their decisions. But the evidence is also useful for our donors, and I can give you an example of that. The End Violence Fund, which is one of the largest donor organizations in the online violence space, they funded UNICEF, ECPAT, and Interpol to design and implement the Disrupting Harm project in 13 countries in Africa and Asia. And Disrupting Harm is focused specifically on the issue of online child sexual exploitation and abuse. It consists of 9 different data collection components, which is implemented in every single country. It ranges from collecting survey data from children and parents, to estimate the extent of online abuse, to interviews with governments, with law enforcement personnel, justice actors, frontline service providers, children who went through the justice system with cases of online abuse, and child survivors of online abuse as well. All of this designed to understand the nature and extent of online sexual abuse in country and how the national protection systems are responding to this crime. Now, this evidence obviously helps to build a detailed roadmap for countries to strengthen national capacity, but it also enables End Violence Fund as a donor to make further evidence-informed investments in the same set of countries to address precisely those issues that we uncovered in our research. And this is exactly what they've done in their most recent investment, which is a great investment strategy. To round off, I see 2 key issues in the current data and evidence landscape that will be particularly important to address going forward. The first is that we sometimes continue to engage in policy or lawmaking, programming, and advocacy without always having good enough evidence to support it, or by relying on evidence from other countries when you're trying to make changes in your own country, for example. I think that can work in some cases, but I would argue that for countries to achieve a high degree of precision in the ways that they address online risks and harms and opportunities, extensive and high-quality national research is necessary. And this is particularly important when decisions we make affect children. We need to achieve a high degree of precision. And the research that we do, it needs to involve the people who experience the issues that we're trying to address. It's not good enough, for example, to rely only on reports from the industry to try to understand the extent of online abuse. We need to hear the voices of children and of families to know what they are experiencing. And that leads me to my second point, which is that we need to be mindful in our evidence generation as well as in our policy and programmatic work and in our advocacy that what we call online violence or digital harm does not only happen in the digital environment. Some of the harm does. Some of this harm happens online in digital spaces, but some of it happens offline, facilitated by technology. Recording sexual abuse and sharing or selling the videos online is one obvious example of that. The digital industry can remove the video, which is very, very important, but the physical crime was already perpetrated. So how can we prevent that? We have ample evidence from Disrupting Harm that technology is now being used as part of in-person sexual violence against children. But really the crime sometimes occurs in person, not just online. And I'll end by saying that we see clearly in our data that the strongest predictor for a child experiencing sexual abuse online is that they have experienced other forms of violence in person. And whether this is because technology is now frequently used as part of violent experiences, as part of sexually abusive experiences, or if it's because children who experience all forms of violence share some underlying vulnerability, I cannot say at this point. But what is clear is that online abuse and in-person abuse is somehow related. And my suspicion is that these issues really need to be dealt with together. And the data and the evidence that we generate needs to reflect that. Thank you all very much for listening.
Hi, my name is Daniela Ligero, and I'm the CEO of Together for Girls. I'm delighted to be with you here today for this special session on using data and evidence to end child sexual exploitation and abuse. Let me tell you a little bit about the organization I'm with and some of the ways in which we use data and evidence to really combat child sexual exploitation and abuse happening all over the world. Together for Girls is a global public-private partnership that works to end sexual violence all over the world. And we're a unique partnership that's been over 23 countries around the world. We bring together governments, the UN, civil society, and national governments from around the world. USAID has been a critical partner of ours since the beginning when we first started the partnership over 10 years ago. Our model is pretty straightforward. We use data and advocacy to drive action. We believe that true action can only happen when it's based on evidence and data. And for that, we have nationally led multi-sectoral responses that are created based on those data. The data pillar is led by the for Disease Control, CDC, and we do these through comprehensive quality data at national level, looking at violence against children and adolescents aged 13 to 24. And we look at a variety of different forms of violence. Again, we're active in over 23 countries. And the VACs, the Violence Against Children and Adolescents surveys, you might have heard of them, are really how we do this data pillar. We now have data for over 10% of the world's population under 24 on issues of violence. And the VACS is pretty comprehensive. It looks at everything from sexual violence to physical violence, also health outcomes, community violence, migration, gender attitudes, education. And we've recently started adding modules focused on online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And really one of the interesting things is that we're finding that there's a continuum between the violence that's happening online and the violence that's happening in person. It's essential for us to understand what is happening at a national level and with children and adolescents before we're able to respond programmatically in an effective and efficient way. So just to give you a sense, this is data from Namibia, where we asked a variety of questions related to online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And you can see that if you look at the very bottom of the graph, one of the things we found is that both among boys and girls under the age of 18, 15% of boys and 18% of girls experience some form of online sexual exploitation or abuse, whether it was asking them to share videos, whether it was unwanted sexual messaging, or whether it was doing something sexual on the internet. And so there you can get a sense of the magnitude, the size of this issue in a country like Namibia. And we believe that these data, as we continue to get more and more data for the surveys with the online piece on it, will really start to show the magnitude of this challenge, as well as how it is interconnected with violence that's happening in children and adolescents' experiences every day in their own lives that's not online. In fact, with COVID, one of the things we've seen is that there have been significant increases on the experience of child sexual exploitation and abuse for children and adolescents. Again, these are not our data, but it gives you a sense of how the situation has really been amplified because of COVID. For example, we've seen increases across countries in Cambodia and Ghana, 20, 30, 60, 100% increases in terms of reporting of child sexual exploitation and abuse online. And we believe this is really just the tip of the iceberg. So in sum, I want to say a couple things to do effective programming when it comes to protecting children and adolescents, whether it's online, offline. Having data and evidence is critical. And the second thing I want to say is that it is important for everyone who is working in the digital space, like many of you are, to think about how we can make sure that children are safe online. In anything we do, it is our duty and our responsibility to think about that within a broader digital context. And finally, I just want to say this importance of understanding the continuum of harm of experiences offline and online is really critical if we're to take a comprehensive view around how we keep kids safe. And USAID, through all of its implementing partners, the work they do with national governments all over the world and its strategies can really make sure that children are protected, whether it's online or offline. Thank you for all that you do. And I'm delighted to be with you here today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Letourneau, and I am professor in the Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I also direct the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse. For more than 30 years, I focused my research on child sexual abuse prevention, policy, and practice. And research findings from myself and my team have been cited by the American Law Institute and by numerous government and non-governmental agencies that seek to more effectively prevent child sexual abuse. It's my pleasure to also introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Cito. Michael is a registered clinical and forensic psychologist and a research director with the Royal Ottawa Healthcare Group, as well as professor in psychiatry at the University of Ottawa. He has published and presented extensively on pedophilia, sexual offending against children, and online sexual offending, and he's written very well-received books on pedophilia and sexual offending against children in 2008, and a second edition coming out that came out in 2018, and on internet sexual offending in 2013, and I believe he has a second edition that he's working on for the internet offending book. These were all published by the American Psychological Association. Together, we are leading two large projects aimed at transforming the science around child sexual abuse prevention, as well as numerous additional research projects in this space. We're delighted to be here at this initial foray by USAID into online child safety. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I'm really pleased to be able to participate today and enjoyed watching the sessions earlier this morning. As Elizabeth says, this is an area of particular focus for me and something that I've really been appreciating collaborating with Elizabeth on. What I'm going to talk about today is the focus of our two main projects looking at perpetration prevention as part of our social response to this problem of online harm to children and young people. This slide's just, my part of the presentation, but I'm going to hold on it for a moment because I know these videos are being recorded for later viewing, but this is just to share my email address and my social media handles. I appreciate anybody who wants to reach out and get a copy of these slides or some of the materials that I'm going to be talking about today. I first want to talk by establishing a baseline. What are we talking about when we're talking about online harm? This is just a sampling of the data that's accumulating now about the extent of this problem. What I have here is a bar graph showing you the prevalence rates of different forms of online harm to children and youth. On the left, there's two estimates of online harm from a review conducted by Madigan and her colleagues, published in 2018, of 9 studies that have been conducted between 2005 and 2015 that found that over 1 in 5 young people had been exposed to unwanted exposure to sexually explicit materials while online, and about 1 in 10 children had been sexually solicited by another person online. And I think that's really remarkable considering that, that time span of 2005 to 2015, includes the era before smartphones became readily available, where I'm pretty confident that almost everyone, if not everyone, attending today has one of these devices nearby. And also it's pre the onset of some of the most popular communication apps. And I think reflecting that increased opportunity for harm and exposure to potential harm. If you look at the next two graphs, next two bars, I should say, on this graph, there's a study that was conducted by the Thorn Foundation, looking at a survey of children and young people between the ages of 8 and 17, asking them about online sexual interactions with an adult, which might include sexual chat or request for a sexual image and so forth. 1/4 of the young people reported that they'd experienced this. And then most recently, a collaboration as part of their global threat assessment, We Protect Global Alliance, in partnership with the Economist Impact Unit, did a survey of over 5,000 young adults talking about their experiences as young people, and found that 39% reported that a sexual image of theirs had been shared without their permission. So we can really see, I think, the extent of these concerns. Now, We've heard earlier about the different kinds of responses that we can take in this, and I certainly think they all have a place in a comprehensive response to this problem. With regards to technology platforms, law enforcement, we need to provide more and better services to victims of these incidents. But I think the common threads, that we, Elizabeth and I, and our teams in particular, really want to shift is we have tended to be reactive. We respond to the problem once it's occurred. And we need these responses, but we are arguing, and I think that there's a momentum building for the idea that we can be proactive and intervene before harm has occurred. After 2 years of a pandemic that has affected us globally, I hope we can all agree, I know that not everyone does, but I still hope that we can all agree that prevention is better than reaction. I think it's a scientific, economic, and moral reality that vaccines and masks and ventilation are better than hospitalization and possibly long COVID in terms of dealing with the COVID pandemic. Reflecting that, I'm really pleased to hear from the CDC earlier this morning, that there's, I think, a real momentum building towards a public health approach towards sexual violence and violence prevention more generally. Elizabeth is going to talk more about this in her part of the presentation, but briefly, this public health approach recognizes 4 steps. That we need to first define the problem and establish, the prevalence of it. We need to identify the risk and protective factors that increase or decrease the likelihood of this problem. We need to then develop and test prevention strategies. And then once we've found those that are effective, we need to spread them as widely and quickly and efficiently as possible. And so, as Elizabeth was referring to, we're collaborating on a 5-year program of research funded by the Human Dignity Foundation and the Oak Foundation that's addressing all of 4 steps. So you heard earlier this morning that we're collaborating, for example, with the CDC in introducing perpetration questions into their violence against children surveys. And that's ongoing work. We're working with other partners as well to derive better and international estimates of the prevalence of different forms of online and offline perpetration against children. As part of that work, we're also going to collect information about potential risk and protective factors, drawing on the scientific literature that we have so far to highlight sort of the most promising candidates that we can focus on. And again, moving beyond, what we have currently with regards to more restricted geographies and more selected samples, really trying to get better international data on those factors. And then in parallel and conjoined with that, have been reviewing what's available in terms of perpetration prevention, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the examples of that as part of my presentation. We're going to be, with the support from the Oak Foundation, looking at evaluating the most promising candidates that can, have the potential to be accessible, scalable, and effective, of course, and then doing our best to promote those at an international level. Now, there's different kinds of prevention approaches, and we've heard, about that earlier today. For example, what technology and industry can do in terms of preventing online harm, what parents can do, what we can offer to young people in terms of, education and awareness campaigns or school-based campaigns and so forth. What I'm going to focus on is perpetration prevention. Now, first off, to make sure we're all on the same page, what I mean by perpetration prevention is the offering of education, skills, knowledge, support to people who have either been perpetrating online harm against young people, or who, in particular, we're particularly interested in identifying individuals who are at risk of perpetrating online harm. For example, because they have a sexual attraction to children, they have sexual thoughts or feelings about children. This is something that we could do to intervene. The first example I want to talk about there's been an explosion in recent years of confidential helplines for people who have concerns about their sexual thoughts or feelings about children. So one of the better known ones is offered by Stop It Now in the United Kingdom and Ireland. As this slide shows, it's an anonymous and confidential helpline available both by phone and by chat. The slide's a little busy, but what I wanted to show you is that we have been collaborating with them, looking at some of their use data. And this is the helpline data looking at 2020. And if you look carefully at this graph, what you'll see is that the number of calls and queries to their helpline doubled from early 2020 to the first wave of the COVID pandemic and the first lockdown, which fit with some preconceptions that we had and some other data that you've heard about earlier that suggests that there really was an increase in potential and actual perpetration with that first lockdown as children are at home from school, adults at home from their workplaces, and they're buying more, creating more opportunity. Another example of this, also available from Stop It Now in the UK and Ireland, is a self-help website geared towards individuals who identify as concerned about their sexual thoughts and feelings regarding children, where they can click through and look at different modules that provide them with some knowledge and tips on how to manage those thoughts and feelings, providing other resources as well. And again, in our collaboration with them, looking at use data in going from early 2020 to that first wave of the pandemic lockdowns, there was an increase of about a third of visits to their self-help website. Another example, and this is, I think, a really innovative one, this is a pilot project conducted out of Sweden, led by researchers at the Karolinska Institute. It's called Prevented. And what it was an online intervention, so similar to the one I just told you about in terms of people self-identifying as concerned about their sexual thoughts or feelings about children, but where the innovation was that they also had contact with a trained clinician. So it was a pilot project that was funded by the Swedish government, where they accessed, or I should say recruited, people who had these concerns on the darknet, posting in different forums where people, maybe exchanging CSAM or looking for CSAM, child sexual abuse materials, but also maybe talking to other people about these concerns. And just like a clinical trial with a medication or psychotherapy, they were randomly assigned to the active condition, which involved these series of modules and opportunities to do exercises and get feedback on their homework with a trained clinician, or they received a placebo condition where they had some reading materials, but they didn't have that active engagement with a trained person. They did pre and post assessments on different important factors, and they're just now beginning to look at their preliminary results. I think this is a really interesting, as I said, innovation, because it is reaching people in a place that we're increasingly aware is part of this landscape with regards to the risk of online harm to children and young people, meaning the darknet. And in the idea that it has both the scalability of a self-help website or a helpline, but with that extra, hopefully, potential impact of having a trained clinician working with people. And then last, I want to talk about a new program that's begun here in my home country of Canada, funded by the Canadian government, called Talking for Change. It's actually both things. There's a confidential helpline and chat line for people, who self-identify as having concerns, as well as in-person therapy in the province of Ontario and in the Atlantic provinces here in Canada for people who want more intervention than a helpline might offer. And that also is just begun, and it's another pilot project. I wanted to share these with you because I really think it's tremendously exciting to me that there's this momentum building towards the idea of child sexual abuse perpetration prevention, offered in different modalities, whether they're helplines or self-help sites or clinician-guided online interventions or in-person therapy. That these kinds of interventions can be joined up with, what else is going on in terms of, technology companies doing more in terms of deterrence and intervention, in terms of parent education and awareness, in terms of things that we can offer to young people themselves. And I know that Elizabeth is going to be talking about two programs in particular that really are more geared towards young people. I'm looking forward to hearing from her, and I'm also looking forward to any questions that people have. I'm looking forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I always love getting to hear you present. So again, I'm Elizabeth Letourneau, and I direct the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse, which I launched 10 years ago with generous philanthropic support from Steve and Julia Moore, whose family was affected by child sexual abuse. At the center, we seek to affect change through research, through education, communication, advocacy, and policy. And all of these efforts are geared toward preventing harm from occurring in the first place. Michael briefly presented on the four-step public health approach to violence prevention. That approach guides the work at the Moore Center, which I'll describe in a moment. But before I do that, I want to take a step back and talk about how I talk about prevention. I do this because people often will tell me that they have a difficult time envisioning what I mean when I talk about child sexual abuse prevention. And I know you just heard Michael describe some really interesting and innovative perpetration prevention interventions, but I still think it helps to have a way to engage with people who have not previously thought about child sexual abuse as a preventable public health problem. So the examples that I use originate from Johns Hopkins because it's where I work. This isn't necessarily what might work for you and your work. But at Johns Hopkins University, where I work, public health scientists pioneered the use of latex gloves by surgeons. They invented the child safety car seat, and they refined and improved polio vaccines. And each of these prevention tools, the gloves, the car seats, the vaccines, seems easy and obvious today. But each of them required development, which requires real resources. And each of these met with real resistance early on. Physicians and nurses, some of them were allergic to early glove prototypes, but even more than that, many of them believed in even a very thin barrier, physical barrier between them and their patients interrupted the therapeutic alliance and the therapeutic process. Many people did not like car seats. This is true in my own family. My parents, almost exactly 18 years ago, I was putting my first car seat in a car, and I can remember breaking down in tears because it was so hard. And of course, today we witness vaccine skeptics, and there have always been there. Fortunately, most people do engage in these with these public health strategies. Nobody would let a doctor or a surgeon operate on them without gloves. We all use baby car seats without even thinking about it. It's the law of the land, and fortunately, most people do recognize the promise of vaccine over the threat of disease. And I believe that the prevention of child sexual abuse could look like this. That in 5 or 10 years, with the right resources that we're seeing coming from foundations now, with Human Dignity Foundation and OAK, but also from governments, thank goodness, really investing, and big tech and other sectors, really investing in prevention to get us on the right path here. That with this kind of investment, we could have strategies that 5 or 10 years from now seem easy and obvious. So I hope that was useful in terms of how to help people kind of get outside of the mindset of child sexual abuse as uniquely unpreventable and into the mindset that this is a preventable public health problem, and we need prevention to be among the strategies that we focus on. At the Moore Center, we are engaged in a lot of different projects. Michael mentioned the human dignity work that we're doing that focuses on the first 2 steps of the public health approach to violence prevention, including identifying the scope of the problem through developing rigorous prevalence and incidence estimates nationally and internationally, and identifying risk and protective factors. That work is crucial because knowing when and where and under what conditions child sexual abuse is more likely to occur is going to help us first design prevention strategies that are effective because they mitigate risk factors or they promote protective factors, and it's going to help us strategically deploy those strategies where they are needed most. So these first 2 steps, prevalence and risk and protective factors, are absolutely critical and have received almost no resources in this space. So we are really excited that the Human Dignity Foundation is funding us to do some of that work, and we hope others do as well. Step 3, of course, is around developing and especially rigorously evaluating prevention interventions. And Michael described a couple. I'll describe a couple that we've developed at the Moore Center in a moment. And then the 4th step is ensuring widespread adoption, dissemination and adoption, and modification of effective programs when needed for new regions and new populations. Part of that 4th step is the work that we do on figuring out how do we communicate to help ensure a shared understanding of child sexual abuse as preventable. So I want to talk about 2 interventions that we've developed in the Moore Center and are testing or have tested. One of these is Help Wanted. This is an online prevention intervention. It's free and online. And it's a self-help intervention for people who have sexual attraction to children. There are 5 core training sessions, which are depicted here on the slide. And each session includes brief didactic videos, as well as a mix of engaging interactive materials like drag and drop procedures or journaling or live testimonials. Well, they're not live, pre-recorded testimonials from people who have survived sexual assault to help the help seeker understand the harmfulness of it, and also testimonials from people living with sexual attraction to children who haven't acted on it in support of doing so. That is, living in support of living with sexual attraction without acting on it. We launched Help Wanted to the public in May of 2020, and as of this past month, January, we had over 216,000 visits to the site. More than 10,000 people have gone into the site, and thousands have gone into and completed at least one session. We made transcripts of the intervention available in multiple languages, and you can see there how many downloads we have in those languages. We've attracted positive attention from big tech. Google Foundation has given us some funding to support an adaptation of Help Wanted to another language and another country. Right, we're in the throes right now of figuring out where best to do that. Meta, formerly Facebook, has invested heavily in advertising for Help Wanted, and we know that's one big reason why we've got so many visits to this site. In addition, we're engaging in some additional content development right now that I can talk about later if there's interest in that. The CDC gave us granted us an award to evaluate Help Wanted, and I should note Help Wanted has two major goals. One is to provide support to people who need help controlling their urges so they don't act on their attraction. Many people with sexual attraction to children do not need that help. They are already committed to and successful at avoiding sexual harm to children. However, as you might imagine, having a sexual attraction to children comes with a lot of stigma. A lot of people internalize that stigma and experience self-loathing. Suicide attempts, suicidal ideation are very high among the population of people with sexual attraction to children. So the other part of Help Wanted is really targeted towards encouraging and supporting health and well-being more generally. So we don't know if it works. We did everything we could to develop an effective intervention, but we need to test it to see if it does work. And so we have funding from the CDC to do a randomized controlled trial where 2/3 of the participants will get Help Wanted right away. Another third will be held off for a little while. We'll evaluate before and after and compare between groups to see, do we get improved behavioral intentions to avoid acting on harmful behavior, or to avoid engaging in harmful behavior, and do we get improvements in mental and physical and behavioral health and well-being that we're also hoping to engage to engender with this intervention. We have already gotten feedback from help seekers who voluntarily leave feedback on what works and what needs work with this intervention. It is very positively received. There are always ways to improve it, and so we're actually making some adaptations, some modifications to Help Wanted before we launch the randomized controlled trial in a couple of months. Another intervention that we have is that we've developed is responsible behavior with younger children. And this intervention targets middle school age children ages 11, 12, and 13. And the reason that we developed a prevention program targeting children and specifically targeting prevention of the onset of problem sexual behavior is research by David Finkelhor and his team and others has shown that somewhere between 50 and 70% of sex crimes committed against children are committed by children, usually a few years older and typically right around the age of early pubescence. So that seems like a lot, right? 50 to 70%. That's a big proportion of harm against children being caused by other children. But it makes sense if you consider that children and all of us are most vulnerable to making mistakes and bad choices just at the time that we're learning to engage in a complicated new behavior. And intimacy, sexual relationships, there is literally nothing more complicated than that. And so kids make mistakes, and that's not that is something that we should expect and that we should help them with, but we don't. You know, if we think about children learning to drive, we give them, I have a child who is just about to turn 18. He just got his provisional license. He did great. He's a fantastic driver. He still backed into 2 different garages when he was learning to drive. And we only own 1 garage, so that was a feat. So we know kids are going to be terrible drivers, even the best of them. And we give them a lot of support around that. And we don't treat them as if they were 35-year-old inebriated adults when they make a mistake, right? We understand that there's going to be mistakes, and we provide additional supervision, additional training, whatever, to make sure that they get back on the right path. When it comes to intimacy, sexual behaviors, not only do we not really tell kids a lot, we actively withhold information from them often. And we seem to assume that they will just know that younger kids are off limits as they become sexual. And they do not know this. And we see this in victim surveys. We see this in arrest rates. Arrest rates for sexual crimes against younger children increase from ages 11 to 12 to 13 to 14. And then they steeply decline. So kids do figure out the rule that younger kids are off limit when they're about 15 years old. By then, many of them have already caused harm and already exposed themselves to legal interventions, which are also often quite harmful to children. We think we can do better by teaching kids not to involve younger children in sexual behaviors with some overt education. So we have an 8-session curriculum that targets 4 main core content components that you see here on the slide. This is an intervention that ultimately will be delivered by educators. Right now, as we test it, we are delivering it ourselves. We have completed a small randomized control trial with 4 Baltimore City public schools, including the school that my own children attend in Baltimore City. And what we found is that the intervention was well tolerated by educators, by parents, by students, and relative to the kids who had not yet completed or gotten exposed to RBYC, the kids who had been exposed to RBYC demonstrated significantly more accurate knowledge about child sexual abuse, about the laws that govern minor sexual contact, and about sexual consent, which I would argue puts them ahead of a lot of adults. The money shot in this particular randomized controlled trial were behavioral intentions. We asked kids about their intentions to engage younger children in sexual behaviors and also to help prevent other kids from doing so. And we saw a significant increase in behavioral intentions to avoid and prevent harm against younger children, and also to avoid and prevent harm against peers. We include some peer sexual harassment prevention content, not a lot, so we were surprised to get that result. We were pleasantly surprised. What we need to do next is to do a much larger trial. We have just submitted a proposal to the NIH. NIH funded our original pilot trial. We've just submitted a proposal to fund a much larger study that would involve 40 schools instead of 4, to really see if we are getting signals that RBYC is reduced with reduced behavior, reduced onset of actual behaviors of sexual harm against children. We are also currently adapting RBYC for children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And as with Help Wanted, we're always looking to see if there are other areas of content that we need to build out. Before I open us up to the Q&A, I do want to just address briefly some common errors, oversights, and challenges that I've encountered. So I've been in this space for 34 years now, and there's a few things that kind of come up often. and they are listed on this slide. One is that we default to treating children who have caused sexual harm as if they were adults. So we place children in prison, we put them on sex offender registries in this country and in a couple of other countries. Sometimes children are eligible to be sent to indefinite sex offender civil commitment confinement. Kids are not adults. They don't have the same experiences. They don't have the same neurological development. They don't have the same understanding of the potential harmfulness of their behaviors. And so I would encourage everyone who is listening or who may listen to this in the future and who has any say in what we do with kids who have caused harm or have engaged in problematic sexual behavior is to please understand that those may be signals for the need for treatment or the need for closer supervision or some education. They are not signals that this is a predator or a psychopath or a pedophile or someone who needs to be put in prison and put on a registry. We've got to stop treating children as if they were adults when they start engaging in sexual behaviors. The second point I'd make is to pay attention from the data to the data, and particularly data collected from children. You heard from Daniela Liero earlier today. You saw from Michael that there are some really nice surveys being done to get a sense of what are children experiencing when they're online. And most of them are not experiencing a lot of harm from unwanted sexual advances or experiences. And they do report benefits from digital access to the World Wide Web. So there are real harms out there. We have all seen them. They need real solutions. At the same time, it doesn't serve us well to overhype what is already a bad problem. We don't need to suggest that it's bigger than it is. So I would ask people to be careful when they're throwing out numbers and to really try to adhere to the science. Avoid criminalizing or pathologizing normative sexual behavior. Kids engage in sexting. We've done research, David Finkelhor, many others have done research. Sexting is a normative part of sexual and romantic relationships now, and we should not be treating these kids as if they were adult perpetrators who have engaged in child sexual abuse material, developing it when they've sent a picture of themselves to their boyfriend or vice versa. And then finally, you have listened to Michael and me, and we've talked about people with sexual attraction to children, children who have engaged in problem sexual behavior. You've not heard us talk about predators. You've not heard us talk about pedophiles. You've not heard us talk about sex offenders even. Those are really loaded terms that really, when somebody hears them, they immediately think unpreventable punishment's the best we can do. And that's problematic for us because it means for the last 40 years that we've been addressing child sexual abuse in a real way in this country and in many other countries. We've put all of our resources into criminal justice. And we need criminal justice. We 100% need support for survivors, but we have got to add prevention to the mix. And we won't get there if we forget that we're talking about people. These are people who are amenable to prevention efforts. They are amenable to treatment efforts. And if we can remember to put the person first when we are talking about and writing about these populations, it encourages, again, that shared understanding of child sexual abuse as a preventable public health problem. I'll just give you real quickly, there's examples of person first language that I think are helpful. We don't talk about schizophrenics, for example. We don't talk about people with, we don't talk about HIV or AIDS patients. We talk about people with schizophrenia. We talk about people living with HIV or living with AIDS because we want to center the person first, which encourages then the development of prevention and effective interventions. So I am going to leave it at that and open us up for Q&A.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat, and we did get a question. I thought I would start responding, if that's okay, and then look to you for your thoughts on it as well. So the question is about what do we see as the major barriers to shifting our focus to perpetration prevention rather than the more typical focus on victimization prevention. That's from Maggie. So I think there's like lots of things. There's multiple things going on. I'll think of two in particular. One that I think Elizabeth just alluded to in her presentation, which is that I think one of the factors that has been a barrier for perpetration prevention is a concern that it's a zero-sum situation, meaning that if we spend one more dollar towards perpetration prevention, that's $1 away from survivor support, or $1 away from, parent or child education and awareness, et cetera. And I certainly don't subscribe to that. I understand that budgets are not infinite and that policymakers have to make decisions about this, but I think Elizabeth are the idea that we're talking about additional resources towards this problem, given we do all have, socially, we have a vested interest in children being able to participate in an online world in a healthy and beneficial way. So I think that's one thing, is that getting away from the idea that $1 spent towards perpetration or potential perpetration is $1 away from something else. The second issue, I think, is, again, and Elizabeth has actually, we both referred to it in our presentations, right? It has to do with the stigma and the anger and the fear about people who might pose harm to our children, which I totally get. I've been studying pedophilia and sexual offending against children for 30 plus years. And the number one reaction I get to anybody who doesn't know about the work I do is something along the lines of, how could you possibly do this? It's so horrible. These people should be locked up forever. Somebody with pedophilia is guaranteed to offend against children, all these different ideas. And I understand where that comes from. It comes from a place of real concern for children and fear and anger that this harm might happen. I understand it, but I think that those are barriers because, as you can imagine, given that level of reaction, it really gets in the way of us being able to do more in terms of perpetration prevention. So, for example, imagine a young person who's realizing that as they're getting older and their friends at school are starting to date and get involved in relationships with peers, that they're not interested in their peers, that they are attracted to much younger children. Who are they going to turn to? Right? This is not, there's lots of hard conversations people can have with their family. This has got to be at or near the top of the list, given that stigma. They could go to a therapist, but, there's been some research recently showing that mental health professionals also carry particular attitudes and beliefs about people who are attracted to children, and that can get in the way of therapeutic engagement. So I'll just start with there because I do want Elizabeth to respond to this as well, but those are two things that I see.
Thanks, Michael. I think actually that was a great answer, and if it's okay with you, I might go to the next question in the chat. There's a couple more that have popped up. One is requesting more information on our what the writer has characterized as our collaboration with Facebook and other tech companies on the child helpline evaluations. And that was not a collaboration with big tech. That was a collaboration with the people that stood up and operate those helplines. So with the Stop It Now UK and Stop It Now USA organizations. What Google and Facebook, now Meta, have done is to provide links to people who appear to be searching for help for sexual attraction to children. They link to Help Wanted, or they link to other available prevention and intervention resources. And then, as I mentioned, Facebook has also generated, with our input, ads to help get the word out about the availability of Help Wanted, and they are also doing that with other prevention interventions as well. The next question, and Michael, I'm going to throw this one to you, is how do you see the proliferation of pornography and unhealthy intimate relationship images?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of concern about exposure to pornography, particularly early onset of exposure, certainly much younger in current generations than in past generations, with the availability of this kind of material online. And, there's a whole big debate. We could practically have another session about this, but I do think it's fair that there is some evidence that it can have harmful effects. I don't think it's a uniform effect. It's particularly, vulnerable young people who might have, other vulnerability factors that would increase their risk of perpetrating sexual harm. And I'm going to take this question as an opportunity to really throw to something that I think is really important that we haven't talked about so far, which is the importance of comprehensive and accurate sex education, which is another, I know, hot topic. It's a tricky issue, right, involving an intersection of lots of different social and political factors. But to me, it's very clear that comprehensive and accurate sex education can have so many benefits, not only in terms of actually educating young people so they're better prepared to negotiate consent and, the onset of sexual and romantic relationships, preventing unwanted teen pregnancy, sexually transmitted disease. Basically, it's all kinds of benefits. And this is one of them because, one of the things that we've been seeing in research on pornography use is that young people are turning to it as a source of information about sex. And frankly, I would much rather they get that information from qualified educators and their parents, if their parents are ready and willing, and I think we could do more to support the parents, than from online and dubious sources.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Michael just said about that. And then I would just also add, each generation of parents has believed that there was some kind of existential threat to childhood. So the advent of the radio, the advent of rock and roll, the advent of television, and the advent of the internet is no different in that regard. And again, I would say on par, it certainly appears that access to the digital world is a social good. It is something that children need access to, obviously guided and supported and titrated by age. But we've seen the internet go from not existing to being in our pockets in the last 20 years. And we haven't seen children turn into, kind of raving psychosexual lunatics in that same time frame. So they are figuring out how to navigate this. They need more help from parents and qualified educators, 100%. And then we also really need to align our legal policies and our interventions to better reflect what is normative and what are healthy components of a sexual relationship for children, and to better address when it's unhealthy, more effectively address that, again, not through punitive measures, but through support, counseling, education, and the like.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I also wanted to mention, because this was actually something I posted earlier in one of the morning sessions, some recent research looking at 2 different ways that parents can help their kids navigate this online world, where there are, as Elizabeth has alluded to, tremendous benefits. I mean, frankly, the online world is the world that most of us operate in now, right? Whether it's for work or education, socializing, entertainment, you name it. There's games, etc. So these researchers made a distinction between what they described as instructive mediation and restrictive mediation. And instructive mediation was where parents engaged with their children in talking about online safety, what their concerns were, what their expectations were, trying to establish that open communication, which is, I think relevant not only for online safety, but also for offline, right? As kids are developing and emerging as sexual and romantic relationships. So that seemed to be associated with benefits in terms of reduced online harm, whereas restrictive mediation, which was setting strict parental controls and having rules about screen time, or limiting use of certain apps and those kinds of things, the things that parents hope will help their kids, didn't show any benefit of that. In fact, there was actually some evidence of a negative effect. And so to me, that's again, this other avenue that we haven't really been talking about, but I think is an important one, which is engagement and support with parents. That parents, many parents, I think, are prepared to talk to their kids about this stuff, but don't necessarily understand it all. What is TikTok, for example? Not to name a particular app, but it's very popular right now. And what does that mean? What's a secondary account? All these kinds of things. But we could do more to support those parents in having those conversations with their kids, with the hope of better outcomes from it.
There are some other places. So Michael led a review that we've just completed of sort of all the available perpetration prevention interventions, and we were really surprised at how many are out there. He spoke of an explosion, and there really has been, but there are some gaps, and there's not enough out there to support parents, educating their children. But there's also no interventions that we could identify that really support parents, particularly in blended families where you have unrelated adults mixing with preteens and teens, and who may experience some sexual attraction and what to do with that. So we saw an increase in stepfathers reaching out for help to the help lines during the pandemic, where families were kind of stuck together, and those sorts of forces might come to the fore. Likewise, we don't have prevention programming and that target youth serving organizations or educators who might be at risk of engaging in these behaviors, and we need more work there as well. So we really hope to see more resources, particularly at the government level, to start expanding into some of these areas where they're sort of big black holes right now.
With that, I see that we're out of time. So thank you for those questions, and thank you very much for attending this session. And I hope you enjoy the breakout sessions after this.
Yeah, and thank you, USAID, for focusing on this topic. Bye, everybody.
Engage with that tech, and it's just very multifaceted. So for example, first, our citizens and entrepreneurs that we work with should be able to take part in the digital economy and engage effectively with the tools that they need to be able to do that. So if they can't use their tech tools effectively for their businesses, like revenue and growth and sales, or for accessing digital skills that will increase their chances for a meaningful and sustainable livelihood, then it doesn't really help. Second, if you help users access tools for finding a job or becoming more employable, but they're not safe, then they could lose all that they're working for. So even if they know how to use their tools, but expose their businesses or their personal identities to a possible hack, then they become even more vulnerable. So the cyber component of literacy is actually incredibly important as well. There's actually a third component to this. The populations with whom we work need to be able to think critically about the information that they're consuming. So passwords and multi-factor authentication, yeah, that's important, but also critical thinking skills, disinformation and misinformation training, how to spot it, how to ignore it, how to, what to do when you see it, how to reduce its virality and make sure that it doesn't keep getting passed on. If they put in all the safety measures and build financial skills but are victims of a disinformation campaign and realize it, then they potentially lose trust with the digital tool that we've just worked so hard to give them access to. So to achieve digital literacy, we have to have a holistic approach. At DCCP, we are not just about teaching the ABCs. We're trying to build skills to engage effectively, safely, and critically with these potentially life-saving tools. And we're working to hone our upskilling across many different geographies to do just that. So for example, in India, we work with the Digital Empowerment Foundation, and we work with 16,500 rural women entrepreneurs, like micro, small, medium enterprises, and 820 women-led community development organizations through digital upskilling activities in 10 districts across 7 states in India. And the work that we do here includes everything from understanding the various features of a smartphone, how to access online and mobile banking, to incorporating safety tips and cyber hygiene into our literacy curriculum. We've also worked really closely with DEF to include disinformation and media literacy into the curriculum as well, as we know that there's an exorbitant amount of fake news that's spreading across the digital economy. On the policy engagement side of things, our activities focus on awareness raising and advocacy skill building for about 1,500 to 2,000 urban youth and women-led SMEs and CSOs in Madhya Pradesh and Haryana in India, to what we call something called translating digital policies into action. So what that really means is the focus of the work is helping these groups better understand, comply with, take advantage of, and think critically about the technology policy environment. So what are the different policies that are governing their businesses and their organizations' actions? And we do that while we're also helping them develop their skills to advocate and articulate opinions about key ICT policy issues. In 2021 in Thailand, we had a challenge called the Y Kid Digital Challenge, and we trained nearly 400 university students in Thailand on content creation to promote digital literacy, critical thinking, online identity security, and positive online communications. And teams from Thai universities developed creative 90-second videos to raise the importance of positive online behavior, online identity and security, critical thinking, news literacy, and identifying misinformation during COVID-19, which, as we know, was a very, very troubling issue, to help the Thai public safely navigate the online space. At the end of the campaign, we had 6 winning videos and had received over 700,000 reach, 3,000 likes, and 600 shares. In Cambodia, Mongolia, and Bangladesh, we're developing activities that will raise citizens' awareness of cybersecurity issues and build citizens' capacity to practice good online safety habits. So awareness is a really huge part of literacy as well. I could keep going, can talk a lot about lots of different activities, but across all these different approaches, we're both experimenting and learning, we're adapting and iterating as we go. And I'd like to just leave you with 3 key lessons that we've learned across all these different activities. So number 1, we must strive to understand our users. Without user-centered research, we miss the boat in terms of developing digital literacy that fits the needs for our users and meets them where they're at. Actionable data on cyber hygiene and digital habits of our target users is really hard to find. Because of this, I'd advocate that we always start with a rapid assessment of actionable research, like our Frontier Insights work at DAI, that helps provide us with new and practical pathways to help with cybersecurity awareness and direct digital training, and that will allow us to build more targeted interventions with a deeper understanding of our user and market segments. Or even a listening session with our cohorts so that we can get a sense for where they're really struggling and how to develop practical and tangible curriculum that best fits their needs. Number 2, there are emerging trends around what we call critical components of digital literacy curriculum. What we're seeing work well the curriculum, creating practical and actionable and tangible approaches that ensures that our training is not just theoretical, but that the learnings and lessons are being used and acted upon. And we work to learn from that so that we know whether it is actually solving the issues highlighted by the user research and engagement. So it's a cycle of learning and developing and adapting. And finally, stories. We also really work hard to develop communications and learning products so that we can tell powerful stories about how USAID investments are changing lives that only we can really do from the field. So real user stories about how digital security has affected people, how training has helped them recover and build safer systems, and makes a compelling case for investments in security. You can read about some of these things in our blogs and our fact sheets that I'm really happy to share after this event. But all of this really takes time. Investing in programs that are 5 years rather than 2 to 3 years can make all the difference in helping ensure sustainable engagement. Ultimately, we're trying to build our users to be better digitally enabled, aware, resilient, and deeper critical thinkers after we've worked with them, either through training, advocacy engagement, or awareness raising, so that they can engage more effectively and sustainably in the digital economy. Thanks so much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Komal, for starting us off. Now we're going to turn over to Sahana Kaur to talk about digital literacy. Sahana is a 17-year-old Malaysian with a passion for youth empowerment, civic engagement, and digital advocacy. She's driven by the difficulties she's personally faced while attempting to engage in civics, as well as her experiences growing up in an unestablished democracy. Sahana is the founder and director of Project for All, a youth-led nonprofit empowering young people to participate in civic engagement. Sahana is also a member of USAID's Digital Youth Council, and she'll discuss her experiences and thoughts around digital literacy for youth. Sahana, over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Kanchana. I'm Sahana, I'm 17 years old, and yep, as Kanchana said, I'm on the USAID Digital Youth Council. I'm very excited to be here today, and I'm going to be talking about how I built Project All for All, a project I started, digital upskilling issues in Malaysia, and different ways in which we can approach digital literacy, particularly for youth. So first up, Project All for All is a nonprofit project I started over a year ago to make it easier for young people to participate in civic engagement and advancing progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's reached around 106 countries with a couple thousand young people from those countries. And a lot of our initiatives focus on using digital tools and as a medium for advocacy and civic engagement, and also human rights. And so when I was building PAFA, I was focusing a lot on how exactly we can create these initiatives as free and as accessible as possible, which is why obviously we came to rely on the digital ecosystem, because that seems to be the most accessible way of ensuring that, you know, for example, we're not using up carbon emissions by travel to physical events and so on. And the first initiative that we organized was something called the Youth Empowerment for All Conference, which had a large focus on digital advocacy, public speaking, and so on. And we had these amazing workshops on, innovation and how the digital world could be used for activism and similar activities. And it was super informative and so on. But when I was reflecting on the conference a while later, I began to wish that we had also focused on how exactly we could use, on how exactly young people can manage the risks that are associated with using technology. Because it's incredibly important to know how to use tech for advocacy and activism, but it's also important to know how exactly you can manage the risks and the threats that are associated with that, especially since they've become so incredibly pervasive in recent years. And that realization after the conference, that that there was sort of like a gap in the capacity building and education we were providing, sort of sparked my interest in understanding how exactly we can increase digital literacy, especially amongst youth. And that kind of brings me to like my main topic, digital upskilling issues in Malaysia. So kind of like the biggest challenges that we face when trying to, really run initiatives or sort of ensure that digital literacy is common in Malaysia. So some background about the country. So Malaysia is pretty developed, but not fully developed. It is in Southeast Asia. There are two parts of the country separated by an ocean. One is West Malaysia and the other is Borneo. And there's a wide range of landscapes. You've got like, like skyscrapers and everything in the capital, and then you've got like rainforests and everything in Borneo. And these geographic differences make it really difficult for sort of a one-size-fits-all digital upskilling program, simply because it's just really difficult to ensure that the same sort of program or initiative can be used like countrywide, because there's such a big disparity in the way different people live. Another issue that comes with those challenges is the fact that internet connectivity in the capital is extremely high, whereas, like, for example, around, I think, a fifth of the state of Sarawak lacks internet penetration and things like that. So there's just a big difference in the level of connectivity that different people living in different areas have. There's a sort of like urban-rural divide. And during the pandemic, for example, there were like plenty of reports of children needing to, for example, climb trees to access online schooling on both sort of parts of Malaysia. And the challenges were just sort of getting exacerbated by the pandemic. And so even before reaching the point of like, focusing on digital upskilling, we need to sort of ensure digital access in the first place. But in cases where, there is internet access and there is access to devices, another challenge is language barriers. The most common language nationally is Malay, but a lot of information on digital literacy and information on protecting yourself from digital harm is only available in English, which is obviously understandable because English is way more commonly spoken internationally. But the problem is that there aren't many sort of like translation services or just, resources that are originally in Malay available here. And so that makes it really difficult because it's really difficult to ensure that people have, even if they can access those resources, they can understand them because they're in a different language. And another challenge is apathy towards the threat of digital harm. So what I've seen firsthand is that because digital harm seems like such an abstract threat, it's sort of in the digital space, so it doesn't seem as tangible as a real world threat. And this sort of leads to a sense of apathy, particularly amongst young people, with regards to the danger posed by, being involved in the digital ecosystem. And of course, I understand this. I don't think many people read through the hundreds of pages of terms and conditions, for example, before signing up for a service. But it also means that people are really vulnerable to attacks purely because this sort of like disinterest in really understanding how they work. So this other challenge is actually really big, particularly amongst young people. This sort of disinterest in really learning how to protect yourself online. And the thing about upskilling in Malaysia is that there is a demand. There was a recent survey that found, I think, around 90%, even more than 90% of adults in Malaysia think that digital upskilling is really important for job seeking in the future, which is absolutely true. But the thing is that there is very little supply. There are sort of like disparate corporate efforts where people like run programs for employees and sort of like small scale initiatives like that. But there's no, publicly accessible nationwide initiative focusing on digital literacy. And just for the last topic, just how exactly young people focus on digital literacy or approach digital literacy in Malaysia. So the problem is that it's not a very mainstream topic here. It's just not as well known or not as focused on as compared to other topics. And so the only initiatives that I've come across while, sort of doing research on like services focusing on the digital space is just sort of like the occasional social media post created by young people, highlighting a specific cyber attack or giving sort of like tips on protecting yourself online. But again, like no like specific service that I've come across. But I think that this could be solved by incorporating a digital literacy aspect in the formal school curriculum. So it's very unlikely that kids are going to go out of their way specifically to learn about digital literacy. I think I kind of like sort of alluded to that during the apathy point. And so I think it's really important that they're introduced to it in schools. And it doesn't have to be like a year-long course every year or anything like that. Even just like a couple hours a year upon year with sort of increasing difficulty every grade level or complexity, sorry. And I think that could be a really great way of ensuring that everyone, especially in the public school system, is exposed to digital literacy, because a lot of private schools do offer like digital literacy as part of the curriculum and just sort of like workshops every now and then. But the public school system doesn't really have a big aspect of the curriculum like that. And I think that could really make a big difference. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much for listening.
Great, thank you, Anna, for that introduction of the context in Malaysia and some considerations for youth. I'm going to turn it over now to Mike McCabe, who is the agency's senior advisor on youth. He brings over 28 years of professional experience managing international development programs. In his current role at USAID, he's responsible for helping integrate youth engagement and youth development issues across the agency, oversees youth policy implementation, and serves as a senior representative on youth issues in the interagency and external community. Mike will discuss 4 tools and mechanisms on how USAID is advancing youth digital literacy skills and citizenship. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Sahana, for that great presentation as well. I want to focus a little bit more on how we build strong digital literacy through focusing on supporting digital citizenship skills, including building on young people's agency and engagement via context-based learning as a really effective way that we can work with young people on these skills. First, I want to pause and I want you to each think about a young person in your life. So if they're an average digital user globally, which we know doesn't exist because it varies dramatically whether you're in the Philippines or Honduras or wherever, but on average, young people spend 7 hours of screen time on their devices each day and have on average 8 social media accounts. And they're discovering new ways to learn skills online, to connect online, to find the resources they need. And sometimes that's super important resources, not only for their education, but for their wellness. For example, we know that the National Suicide Hotline now receives most of its inquiries for help on mental health issues via online and text versus the old way of voice telephone. And we know that we live in an age of distraction and that youth and adults are often pulled deeper into the rabbit hole of social media through algorithms that are actually set up to keep them more in there. And we've heard and know today, the potential harm of digital media as a double-edged sword, where young people, are seeing skyrocketing levels of cyberbullying, which is impacting just in the US 1 out of 3 youth, according to surveys, or the online sexual exploitation and recruitment into trafficking or radicalization that we've heard of earlier today. And we know that non-digital literate youth are even at higher risk of not being able to always discern the credible from non-credible sources. But in addition to kind of what we're working on through our digital literacy primer and some of the more traditional ways that we're trying to build those capacities, we're also working at USAID to look at how we build these literacy skills through digital citizenship. And I want to take just a few minutes to give you a couple practical tools for your toolbox that hopefully you can use in your youth programming for positive digital literacy and citizenship skill building. As you can see on this slide, it mentions our new youth policy, which will roll out in the coming month. And one of our core principles for that policy is focused on maximizing innovation and use of technology by and for youth by leveraging digital literacy, appropriate skill development, and digital citizenship for positive change. But it's important because this sets a clear expectation in our policy across our entire agency for the next 10 years moving forward on how we see the importance of making sure that access and some of those other components that have already been mentioned in the 2 previous sessions will play into our design of programming. Let's go to the next slide. The policy is really part of a new partnership with this generation of 2.4 billion young people, where we're working together through our Global Lead initiative to really help young people in their efforts to advance sustainable development goals. And we do this through increased support for education, civic political engagement, and leadership across sectors that leverage digital engagement strategies. You'll have access to this PowerPoint afterwards, but in our Global Lead online toolkit, we provide young people and partners access to all sorts of resource tools for effective interventions that are helping young people take action on any issue that they care about. But again, leveraging some of the digital access skills and digital access tools for that. The Global Lead online toolkit and our youthlead.org platform are really good comprehensive tools for young change makers so that they can partner across different countries or colleagues in other parts of their country and sector to design better youth engagement programs in what we call positive youth development and move that out in terms of how we take collective action and help support systems change by putting those digital resources and networks closer together. On the next slide, one good example of our Global Lead related activities has been our work with the youthmappers.org initiative. Youthmappers is now a network of over 5,000 young students at 300 universities around the world that are learning GIS mapping and digital literacy skills and converting these skills into meaningful efforts to map for development. So for example, our Let Girls Learn initiative has increased the engagement of girls to not only learn digital literacy and GIS mapping, but they're also working to map vital services for young women, as well as HIV/AIDS response resources and pandemic response resources. The next slide, our Youth Excel Young Digital Leaders Initiative is one of our newest efforts, and it works with young changemakers in 11 countries on digital and media literacy and helps them to advance civic engagement efforts by having our digital young leaders work with organizations and youth networks to better mobilize, to collaborate with peers on decision-making and on advocacy, all through leveraging digital skills for what we're focused on in this case, which is real inclusion in all the diversity of young people. If you go to the next slide, how do we do that? Well, we've identified with young leaders 6 key competencies for effective digital leadership: facilitation, advocacy, digital tools, and data and learning for inclusion. And with each competency, we've identified a menu of priority skills that will be part of the rollout of this digital leadership curriculum. Next slide, please. Linked to this is the content that will be in this for what we call these 3 learning journeys that we're working together with Microsoft and Generation Unlimited and others to create digital certification platforms on these learning journeys around data champions, youth as community mobilizers through digital technology, and youth as advocates for that. What's unique about this digital leadership development is how it supports young leaders in creating their own research, or what we call implementation research priorities, then conducting online research and data reviews and using digital tools to collect, manage, and analyze the data. And so some of the things coming out of it already for this year are the Youth Digital Leadership Toolkit, a digital skills training program that we're using with youth and teachers in El Salvador, where we provide about 120 hours of coursework that results in a digital certificate for teachers and students, helping them around entrepreneurship and other skills for digital civic action. And then finally, we have a new digital innovation activity in Lebanon that includes digital learning and engagement platform through a bootcamp innovation platform. So there's a lot of different things going on. 2 other resources we could talk about in the Q&A is our Youth Lead platform that I mentioned, which has over 14,000 young change makers that provide peer-to-peer training and consultation using digital tools and using this digital platform for networking. And then the other one, the last one that I'll mention, is a really cool one that is part of our Global Lead related activities called Cyber Rwanda. And in this case, it's working to combine a series of different interventions on effective youth engagement through peer-to-peer education, skill building on a digital platform for reproductive health outcomes. So lots of different tools that are out there. The big challenge now is how do we really make sure that as we're discussing a cohesive strategy moving forward, that we really are taking advantage of the bright spots that are going on where young people are leading on teaching digital literacy through that context of digital citizenship. Thanks so much, and back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for providing that introduction of all of the different programming that USAID has. And we're definitely, we'll get to some of that in a little more detail during the Q&A session. As a reminder, if you do have any questions for any of the panelists, please go ahead and post them in the chat. We will definitely take a look and start pulling that into the conversation. But for now, I'll go ahead and get our Q&A session started with a question for all of the panelists. Especially in the context of youth, we hear this concept of digital natives thrown around a lot. the fact that children and youth are the ones who naturally know how to use tools and technology, can even teach their elders, engage with a host of platforms and content that, that older folks may not necessarily do. So I'd like to, ask each of you, based on your experiences, either in programming or what you've seen, to what degree is this concept of digital native true or a misnomer that we need to address in the context of building digital literacy for youth?
I can start us off, but I actually definitely want to hear from both Sahana and Mike, because I think they've got a lot of really good examples of this. In our experience, it's a huge issue. I mean, I think the fact that we automatically assume that because students and kids, they've just grown up with a cell phone in their hand, and that means they know how to handle themselves digitally. The concept that Mike mentioned, digital citizenship, is a really, there's a big gap between those two things. Having a cell phone and being able to engage with it in an effective and respectful manner. I see this literally with my kids every day. So it's part of it is having access to or exposure to many services that can help them enable their growth in, workforce skill building and finding services that they need. But just having, I think, between both kind of understanding how to engage effectively and respectfully, as well as having that healthy fear of the harm that can befall them in the digital world, I think that is something that we've definitely seen as an issue. In our YKid Digital Challenge, we saw a change in our behavior. So basically, the main focus was creating videos to really talk about what some of those online harms could potentially be. And we did a post survey, and 80% of the bootcamp studies, students were likely to increase their security measures, such as adjusting login habits or setting more difficult passwords, putting in passwords, because frankly, a lot of young people don't even want to do that, and verifying misinformation and fake news. So that, I think, was really helpful. But I'd really love to hear from Sahana and Mike in ways that they've been able to do. They've been able to handle some of those very real challenges.
I'll jump in just really quickly. I think the issue of the concept of being a digital native is definitely, true to a certain degree. And I'm always stunned no matter where I travel in the world with USAID, to see where young people in all sorts of contexts are innovating with, the computer in their hand. I remember in Panama, I was in the Darien, one of the more remote parts of Panama in a jungle area. And I met Juan Jose in the Darien, and he was fixing electronics. And I knew that the tech school there wasn't teaching that. I said, how'd you learn? And he said, YouTube, and he just taught himself and created his own business out of that. But the population of digital natives is remarkably diverse and not evenly distributed. And so, their ability to access connectivity and devices of this generation differs so much based on a lot of different barriers. And we need to take a gender and an inclusion lens to analyze those barriers, as well as where our programming goes based on geographic location and conflict context and economic and gender issues. And we have a moral imperative, I would say, to do this. Otherwise, all we're doing is using an assumption of digital native that allows a digital divide to get bigger. And regarding the awareness of digital harm, I think it's important to, this is an important question we really have to be constantly asking them and telecommunication providers. But I think youth are more aware many times than a lot of adults on the issues of cyberbullying and the toll of mental health from digital harm. So how we're doing structured engagement to really listen, and having folks like Sahana and our Youth Digital Council have really helped USAID in better understanding some of the dynamics of it. So we need to support them more on thinking about disinformation, misinformation, how algorithms and other nefarious elements of work are grooming young people for harm, and then figure out where we work together to design new solutions. So.
Yeah, I think everybody's already really covered it. And I think just to add on, so I think a digital native is usually defined as, someone who's born into the digital age and who's also grown up surrounded with technology. And I think that the first part of that is absolutely true. But I think it's incorrect to assume that, everybody born in the digital age just automatically has access to devices. There's an incredibly pervasive digital divide. So because of that, I do think that it's kind of accurate in the sense that we are all born in the digital age. But I also think that it's a bit of a misnomer because we aren't all really, we don't necessarily all have access to those devices. The young people I've worked with via PAFA and other organizations, we're all defined as digital natives because we were sort of born in that age. But none of us really fully understand the sheer scope of the digital ecosystem and all its various components. So even if we are digital natives, we aren't really sort of fully aware of what that means and what the space really is. So there's a bit of a gap there as well.
Great, thank you so much to all of you. Those were really thoughtful responses. I definitely want to dig into the issue of digital divide and meeting users where they're at. But first, we have a question from the chat that's come in for Mike, asking, are any of these tools that you've described in your introduction available now?
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot of them that are available right now. I mean, the rollout of some of the Youth Excel, Youth Digital Leaders tools will be coming out during this year. But you can find on our youthpower.org and our youthlead.org a lot of our digital tools for digital citizenship. So if you go on to youthpower.org and look for the online Global Lead Toolkit, you can find all the links to resources there. You can also go on to the Youth Lead platform, create your profile, and be part of the weekly exchanges going on between young digital champions there. I am really excited about the rollout of some of the competencies and journey pathways that are going on. One of the interesting things that, for example, Microsoft is doing with Generation Unlimited, who we're collaborating with them this year on what's called the Youth Challenge, is they've been developing this learning passport and this passport to earning, which is focused on getting 25 million young people digitally certified online. And so that's really important work to make sure that we have high quality standards that are giving young people tools. The youthmappers.org, just go there if you're interested in seeing how your school, university can become part of the digital mapping movement. So, yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. And I believe some of our moderators will be posting these links in the chat for you all to be able to take a look at later. And as a reminder, please feel free to continue posting questions. We have a couple minutes left in the session and we'll do our best to get to the questions. But the next question I have for all of our panelists is, to one degree or another, you all have described the question of localizing content and meeting users where they're at in terms of digital literacy. And the fact that foundational access is the first step, as well as when you get to digital literacy programming, sometimes you find, especially when it's corporatized, that the content is not necessarily localized, it's not necessarily even in the local language that where people can access the content. Sahana, you talked a little bit about building digital literacy education curriculum in schools itself to try to, as one example of a way to bridge that gap. I'm wondering if you can all describe a little bit more the different tools and ways that you've seen programs successfully meet users where they're at and build those skills.
Sure, I can start us off again. So actually in USAID Cambodia, we were developing a project around, again, digital upskilling, and it was really focused on awareness raising. So we created a series of videos around cyber skills, and we did a good amount of kind of user research to understand sort of what were some of those really specific skills that folks were really struggling with, and some of them were a little bit more surprising. It wasn't just passwords, but it was very specifics around sharing why shouldn't I share a password, what's the big deal, my family all knows about it, and linking accounts to their household accounts, their business account to their household accounts, and what the potential harms were with that. But what we also did, so one, we did user research around kind of what exactly their challenges were, and you created the videos accordingly. And then The big other issue was that there was little or no Khmer language information available about how to protect people, data, businesses, especially in the face of digital security threats. So a critical part of our campaign was dedicated to ensuring those messages were in Khmer, using a common Khmer phrases. We tested them out. We did user testing even after we created the videos to make sure that they resonated with local folks and especially youth, to understand that these were actually helpful and that they were resonating with them. So that was one kind of small example of ways that we met users where they were at.
Yeah, I've just built on that. The language barriers is a huge issue that we need to tackle together on inclusion. And that includes both, making sure that everything we do is 508 compliant for persons with disabilities, that we have links on a lot of pretty much everything now that we're doing with youth to multi-language translation. So on our Youth Power and our Youth Lead platforms, they're not only hard-coded in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic, but they also have the ability to flip it into multiple languages. But it's hard. Then you get down into more local languages and what we could do. So in Youth Excel, our youth partners, local youth partners, are working to really ensure that our platforms that we're working on are more in those local languages. I mentioned the new Learning Passport platform, which will also be developing online content based on local engagement with partners. One of the other things that I think is really interesting to look at is how we're recognizing the difference in preference of platforms that young people are learning these digital skills on. Hopefully we're all past the time when we thought that, oh, wouldn't it be great if we just worked with Facebook to, do everything, because all youth are on Facebook, which we now know is definitely not true. And it's so diverse in every country. What is the preferred accessible platform that allows young people to download at low cost? So I was talking with Karen Carvajalino, one of our young leaders, who is the founder of the Biz Nation, which is one of the largest online platforms for digital youth entrepreneurship in Colombia. And she was telling me last week that they are in the process of converting all 110 courses that they've developed with young people on digital entrepreneurship into micro learning packages that will be delivered primarily through WhatsApp and Instagram. And I was going, wow, getting my online learning all through micro packages in WhatsApp and Instagram, that's fascinating, but again, that's listening. She listens to all of these young people across Colombia that she's supporting and trying to make sure she delivers it in a low cost, high impact way. So.
Great, thank you both. So we only have a couple of minutes left. We have one more question from a participant in the audience that I'll try to briefly pose to all of you. From your experiences, does it seem that youth are receptive to digital literacy programs? She's wondering what strategies you think might be helpful in engaging youth in learning and caring about digital safety, especially for those who may not be interested in it at first. So basically, have you seen or worked with any situations where you face challenges to youth engagement, and how do you solve them?
Yeah, I can take this question. So I've seen, for example, in my school, a couple of workshops and things like that focusing on digital literacy. And I mean, there's definitely a difference, right? Like some people are really interested in it, some just aren't. And I think you're never going to reach a situation where 100% of young people in the world are interested in learning it. But I think that a way that we can sort of really increase the amount of people who are interested in it is to sort of make it relevant to them. I mean, at the end of the day, all of us use the internet in some way, right? Some people use it for gaming, some young people use it for social media, or most of them do. And I think that finding ways to link those things that they're interested in back to digital literacy and back to these risks, I think that could be a really great way of sort of ensuring that they really are interested and are engaged in it, because sometimes it can just sort of feel like a lecture or something which doesn't really affect individual people, because it doesn't seem like people are going to be targeting a completely random sort of normal citizens. And so I think making it relevant and really highlighting the risks that are there, that could really help.
Yeah, I would say, if it's presented as a standard curriculum issue, the way in many schools, it probably will be treated more like a vegetable rather than a dessert. And we want to really make it engaging. And I think, the way that we partner with like the Youth Digital Council and others to think about creative ways. So I think about like, we partnered a few years back with Evoke, which was a World Bank online gamified version of, digital civic engagement with young people on different key issues that they cared about, and then we measured what changes occurred in their online habits. Or if we, are working, the way we discuss with youth mappers or others, you can use issues that young people are passionate about, or our Learn to Discern program, which is a fun way of learning about identifying, misinformation and disinformation. If we do it in the right way, we'll have a lot better chance than if it's presented in kind of a static curriculum that you should be learning. So.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I love that quote of thinking about building digital literacy as a dessert rather than a vegetable.
Yeah.
This was great. I want to thank all of our panelists again for taking the time to really engage with this topic. Unfortunately, I think we've completely run out of time. So thank you all again for joining us today. And I hope you have a great rest of the day and enjoy some of the other sessions.